For 15 long years, Alina had worn a mask of calm, her every action concealing a simmering storm within. Her husband, Victor, had never suspected anything, believing that time had healed the wound of his infidelity. He had long forgotten that summer, when their marriage had teetered on the brink of collapse. But Alina had never forgotten. Victor had been a charismatic man, successful in his career, and effortlessly charming. Everyone in their small town admired him, seeing him as a pillar of the community. Alina, his devoted wife, had stood beside him, hosting elegant dinners, always appearing the perfect spouse. But that facade began to crack one day, when she learned about the affair. 15 years ago, Victor had an affair with a younger woman, a fleeting infatuation that nearly destroyed their marriage. Alina had confronted him, and Victor, full of apologies and promises, had sworn it meant nothing. He begged for forgiveness, claiming it was a moment of weakness, and Alina, outwardly composed, had agreed to move on, pretending to rebuild their life together. But deep down, she made a vow. One day, he would pay for what he had done. As the years passed, Alina perfected the art of patience. She bided her time, never letting Victor see the pain that still gnawed at her. They carried on as a couple, but the trust between them had been shattered. He was unaware of the resentment that grew in her heart, steadily feeding on every unspoken word, every lingering doubt. She waited, quietly plotting her revenge, determined that it would be slow, meticulous, and final. It was on the eve of their 15th wedding anniversary that Alina saw her opportunity. Victor had fallen ill, complaining of headaches and fatigue that seemed to get worse with each passing day. The doctors were puzzled, unable to pinpoint the cause of his mysterious decline. Alina, ever the dutiful wife, tended to him with care, administering his medication, preparing his meals with meticulous precision. But what Victor didn't know was that the very hands that nursed him were poisoning him. For months, Alina had been slipping a slow-acting toxin into his food and drink, one that mimicked the symptoms of a natural illness. It was the perfect crime, and no one suspected a thing. Victor's body grew weaker, his spirit diminished, and Alina watched with cold satisfaction as he withered away. On their 15th anniversary, as Victor lay bedridden, too weak to even speak, Alina sat by his side, stroking his hand tenderly. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you remember, Victor? Do you remember what you did to me all those years ago?" Victor's eyes widened in fear, but he couldn't respond. He was too far gone. Alina smiled, a slow, chilling smile that was the only real expression she had shown him in years. "I waited for this moment," she continued. "I waited 15 years to make you suffer like I did, to watch you die, slowly, just like our marriage did. Happy anniversary, my love." Victor's breathing became labored, his eyes pleading with her in his final moments. But Alina simply sat there, holding his hand, until the life drained out of him. When the paramedics arrived, they found Alina weeping over Victor's body, the picture of a grieving widow. The doctors ruled his death as natural, a tragic end to a mysterious illness. No one questioned Alina's role in his care. No one suspected the truth. As the town mourned Victor's passing, Alina stood at his grave, her heart as cold as the stone bearing his name. Her revenge was complete, her long wait finally over. In the weeks following Victor's funeral, Alina carried on with her life as if nothing had changed. The townspeople showered her with sympathy, offering their condolences for her loss. She accepted them with the grace of a grieving widow, every tear shed on command, every sigh perfectly timed. The years of meticulous planning had paid off. Her performance was flawless. But something in Alina had shifted. The satisfaction she had expected, the sense of closure she had longed for, was elusive. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness, a void that had not been filled by Victor's death. She had spent 15 years plotting, shaping her existence around revenge. And now, with Victor gone, there was nothing left. She found herself haunted by the silence of their empty home, every creak and shadow seeming to remind her of the life she had taken. It started with the dreams. At first, they were vague, disjointed memories of her life with Victor, the early, happier days of their marriage before the betrayal. But soon, the dreams grew darker, more vivid. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. Victor was there, always there, watching her with those same pleading eyes from his final moments. In the dreams, he tried to speak, but his words were choked, just like they had been when he was dying. Alina dismissed the nightmares as guilt, the kind of fleeting remorse anyone would feel after committing such an act, even when justified. But as the days passed, the dreams became more than just dreams. She began to hear Victor's voice during the day, whispers in empty rooms, the rustling of his presence behind her. At first, she thought it was her imagination. After all, she had lived with Victor for 15 years. It was only natural to feel his absence so acutely. But soon, it was undeniable. One night, as Alina stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, she heard a familiar sound. It was the scrape of Victor's favorite chair, being pulled out at the dining table, just as it had been every evening for years. She froze, the knife slipping from her hand, clattering to the floor. Slowly, she turned to face the table. The chair was empty, of course, but it was positioned as if someone had just sat down. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at it, trying to rationalize what she had heard. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. But when she opened them again, she saw it. The faint imprint of a hand on the back of the chair, as though someone had just rested their palm there. Her breath caught in her throat. From that moment on, Alina could no longer escape Victor's presence. It was in the house, in the corners of every room, in the reflections of the mirrors. She would feel a cold breeze pass by her when no windows were open, or see the reflection of his silhouette standing just behind her in the glass, only to vanish when she turned around. The worst was the night she heard his voice, clear as day, for the first time since his death. "Why, Alina?" The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. "Victor." Alina shot up in bed, her pulse racing, her eyes frantically searching the darkened room. But there was no one there. She was alone. Yet the voice lingered in the air, a low echo that chilled her to the bone. "Why did you do it?" She pressed her hands to her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, as if that would block out the voice. But it was inside her now, haunting her every waking moment. No matter how hard she tried to silence it, it grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with a relentless question that had no answer. Soon, Alina found herself unable to function. She withdrew from the outside world, refusing visitors, ignoring phone calls, and avoiding the curious eyes of the town. She no longer cared about appearances. All that mattered was escaping Victor's ghost, though there was nowhere to run. As weeks bled into months, Alina became consumed by paranoia. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every night the dreams grew more violent. Victor's ghost no longer watched her passively. In her nightmares, he reached for her, his hands cold and accusing, his eyes full of unspoken vengeance. Each time, she would wake screaming, only to find her bedroom as empty as her soul had become. One evening, after another torturous night of whispers and shadows, Alina stumbled out of bed, determined to end it. She couldn't live like this, haunted by the man she had spent so many years hating, a man she had thought she had conquered. The guilt, the fear, the crushing loneliness. It was all too much. She made her way to the kitchen, her movements sluggish and disoriented. As she reached for the drawer where she kept the sharpest knives, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling, when she heard it again. Victor's voice, stronger this time. "You can't run from what you've done, Alina." Her breath hitched as she stood frozen in place, the cold air of the house closing in around her like a noose. She dropped the knife, her resolve shattered. Alina collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing in the empty room. For 15 years, she had waited to take revenge on Victor. But now, it seemed, Victor had his own kind of revenge, one that would torment her for the rest of her days. The house grew silent once more, save for the faint whisper of his voice, ever present, never leaving. In the end, it was Alina who became the true prisoner of her own crime. Alina's descent into madness was slow, but irreversible. Days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and haunted whispers, her once carefully controlled life unraveling thread by thread. She no longer left the house, the walls closing in on her, like a cage she had willingly built, her guilt the key she had thrown away. The townspeople noticed her absence, but they assumed it was the grief of a widow mourning her lost husband. No one suspected the truth, that it was not grief, but guilt that consumed her. One cold, rainy evening, after months of torment, Alina found herself standing in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Gaunt and pale, with dark circles under her eyes, she was a shadow of her former self. Her hair hung in limp strands, and her once sharp, confident gaze was now dull, hollow. But it was not her reflection that terrified her. It was the faint outline of Victor standing just behind her, his eyes locked on hers through the glass. His presence was stronger now, undeniable. Alina no longer questioned her sanity. She had accepted it. Victor was with her, a constant reminder of the crime she had committed, the life she had stolen, and he wasn't going to leave. She had long ago given up trying to rationalize his presence, or to fight against the creeping terror that gripped her heart. Now, there was only one way out. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to the figure in the mirror, her voice broken and desperate. "You win, Victor. I can't live like this." Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out the bottle of pills she had saved for this moment. Her hands shook as she unscrewed the cap, the contents rattling ominously in the silence. Alina stared at the pills for a long time, her breath shallow, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and resignation. The house was deathly quiet, save for the rain tapping against the windows. But then, just as she was about to raise the bottle to her lips, Victor's voice filled the room again, clearer, colder, more commanding than ever before. "Alina, it's not that easy." Her hand froze mid-air, her heart hammering in her chest. She spun around, expecting to see him, but the room was empty. Still, his voice lingered, echoing in her mind, a reminder that even in death, Victor had control over her. "You can't run. Not from this. Not from me." Alina dropped the bottle of pills, her knees buckling beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor. She sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her head as if she could squeeze the voices out. but they only grew louder. Victor's presence filled the room, the air thick with his judgment, his anger, his unrelenting accusation. And then, in the midst of her despair, Alina heard something different, something she hadn't heard in months. It was the sound of the doorbell ringing. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one had visited her in weeks. Who could possibly be at the door now? Slowly, trembling, she made her way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. When she finally reached the door, Alina hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. A part of her knew that whatever waited on the other side of that door, it would change everything. Summoning the last of her strength, she opened the door. There, standing in the rain-soaked darkness, was a man. He was dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. But as he stepped forward into the dim light of the porch, Alina's breath caught in her throat. It was Victor, not the ghostly figure she had seen in her dreams or felt lurking in her home, but Victor, alive, flesh and blood. He looked older, wearier, but unmistakably alive. Alina stumbled back, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. "No, you're dead," she cried, her voice cracking. Victor stepped into the house, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "You thought you killed me, Alina," he said, his voice low and even. "You thought you'd waited 15 years for your revenge. But I knew. I always knew what you were planning." Alina's world tilted. She stared at him in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't understand." "I knew about the poison," Victor continued, his gaze piercing through her. "I knew what you were doing all those months, but I let it happen. I let you think you were winning, because I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose everything." Alina's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor, trembling. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, drowning her in a cold, suffocating fear. Victor had never truly been her victim. He had played her, just as she had thought she was playing him. He had let her unravel, let her fall into the pit of her own guilt, all while watching from the shadows. "You've been living in your own hell," Victor said, kneeling down beside her. "And now, you'll never escape it." Alina's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as she looked into his eyes that were filled with a darkness she had never seen before, not even in her worst nightmares. She had spent 15 years plotting her revenge, only to discover that Victor had been one step ahead of her all along. He had taken everything from her, her sanity, her peace, her life, without lifting a finger. Victor stood, leaving her crumpled on the floor, and walked toward the door. Before stepping out into the rain, he turned one last time. "Goodbye, Alina." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Alina alone in the darkness, the weight of her own choices crushing her like a vice. There would be no escape, no release, no peace. Her revenge had turned on her, and now there was nothing left but the hollow echo of her own madness. And in that moment, Alina realized the truth. She had waited 15 years for revenge, but in the end, it was Victor who had won.